So, are you ready?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. I've been filming since just before you started slurring.
I know. Welcome to another Retropower Uncut, episode 76, I think. It's got to be something like that. Going to start with Utah. So Jim's working on the trim strips that sit on top of the doors. I think we showed those being made last week. They're just being leathered at the minute. The screw holes have been done in those. They're ready to go on. And Dean has dropped off the under dash panels that Scott made last week. He's black leathered those, and they basically close in the underside of the dash. So when you look up in the footwell, you don't see all of the gubbins behind the dash. They look really neat. And he's taken away the column shrouds. So the lower column shroud is completely standard, apart from the cutout on the right hand side, which I think is normally for the gear shifter. I actually can't remember what that was for, but it's now for the ignition barrel, so that's been modified for that, rather than the ignition barrel being on the dash. And then the upper column shroud, quite a while ago now, we 3D scanned that and then made a CAD model of an extended version, which we've then 3D printed and then sort of trimmed to the exact profile of the dash. So it's because the standard one was way too short for our different dash design. So Dean's taken those away. They're going to be black leathered as well. Hopefully they'll be back with us next week. And at that point, that pretty much buttons up most of the bits on the dash. There's something else I'm going to mention while we're talking about this car though, because yesterday was the training day for a new facility we brought in-house, which we've been looking forward to for quite a while. So we are now the proud owners of a 3D scanning setup, which hopefully will allow us to sort of take the next step forward in our ongoing ambition to try and go to the next level in terms of interior builds and component design for the exteriors of modified cars. So we've already been doing a lot of custom parts, and sometimes we've been using 3D scanning, and we've been employing other people to come in and do that. And the more of it we do, the more we realise there's a massive need to do that in-house, and it will really allow us to go to the next level. So, for instance, on the E-Type, which I'll mention in a minute, the plan is with the interior to actually 3D scan the whole of the interior, which will give us all of the mounting surfaces on the original shell, and then we'll be able to CAD design all of the interior components and basically model the entire look of the interior, and then be able to machine or CNC router or 3D print all of the parts as appropriate to go into that interior. But it means we can literally create everything within CAD and model how it's going to look before we make anything, rather than the way we have been working historically of sort of making things up on the fly, which actually works very well. But to push things to the next level, I think this is the next step. So the other day we were covering the back of the car in what looks like spray snow, which gives it sort of a matte finish to stop the reflection on it, because the scanner we've got is a structured light scanner. So it basically projects something that looks like a QR code onto the surface, and then cameras read the image back. And because of the change of size of the different parts of the code, depending on how far or close they are, it can then create a 3D model of what it's scanning. But obviously it gets upset by reflection, so you have to use a matting spray on something shiny like this. Anyway, that's that. Mustang. Adam's just working on the handbrake cables actually, getting those routed through. We've got to make some brackets because I think the floor pans that came with this car were not or didn't have the right brackets on them basically. So we're just going to do a bolt-on bracket that goes where the seatbelt anchorage point goes to hold the handbrake cable outer, and then we're moving on to the exhausts, which is pretty much the last piece in the puzzle before we fire it up. We were provided with some exhaust system components, but to say they weren't particularly good would be an understatement. They didn't really fit, and they were in a fairly unsuitable material, which are really the main criteria you're looking at for an exhaust. So we're going to make our own in stainless steel. Just ordered the boxes and the pipe today, so next week we should be making a start on that hopefully. That's where we're at with that. I'll just scoot over to the E-Type. Obviously talking about some of the things going forward when I mentioned about the 3D scanning, but some of the more hands-on things that we've been looking at on this are the steering rack. we wanted to switch to a more modern design of steering rack, and we noticed that there are some kits out there that use a Mondeo rack, so it looked dimensionally like it might be a good bet. So we got one of those used Mondeo racks here to have a look, and so, sure enough, it does all tally up dimensionally. You know, the centre to centre on the ball joints is right, the pinion's in the right place and roughly at the right angle. So it looks like a good bet, and it's a good amount of turns lock to lock. The only reason we didn't buy the actual off-the-shelf kits that use that rack is that they look really badly made. So we're going to do our own machined brackets for that rather than the fabricated sheet ones that we've seen on some of the kits that are available. So yeah, we're just making little inroads into some of the forward planning on this. In terms of the pump for the power steering, that's another thing we've been looking at, because what we want to do on this is, rather than have the hydraulic belt-driven pump on the engine, which sits down here, we're trying to free up that space so we can put the aircon compressor down there, which normally sits here, which kind of is not very pleasant from a cosmetic point of view. So to relocate that, we are looking at using an electro-hydraulic power steering pump, which is something we've done on some other projects before. There's one used on various Volkswagen Audi Group cars that's sort of a vertical layout with an integral reservoir on it, which looks a really good sort of shape to fit down in front of the footwell on the driver's side. So we've got a used one of those here as well, just to trial that and mock that up and see if that route is going to work. And if it does, we'll then use the used unit we've got to design the bracketry for it. And then for the final build, we'll get a new one, of course. So that's where we're at with this, really, is just starting to chip away at some of the planning things. We'll soon be on with it a bit more intensively in terms of parts design, once George is freed up on some of the things he's on at the moment. We've got in the rear, I think they call it the rear tonneau panel, basically the rear panel that sits behind the boot lid there, because that's one of the bits that is going to stay the standard shape on this, but is damaged and needs replacing. So that'll be one of the standard repair bits of metalwork we've got to do. And then a lot of the other bits of metalwork that are damaged on this are being changed anyway, so there's no point us making a start on any of the sort of metal repairs, because we know all the lower part of the rear panel, the valances are going to be changed, the rear arch shape's going to be changed. So the next stages on that are going to be actually modelling how those changes are going to look. And that's sort of where the 3D scanning also comes in again. So I mentioned about doing an interior, but also things like the rear end of the car, we'll be scanning that once we've got that upper rear panel replaced, and that will allow us to then visualise some of the changes and start designing things like the rear bumpers. The arch shape we were discussing the other day, actually, we could scan that in and model all that in CAD. We're thinking about possibly modelling the shape of the rear arches in clay, just because it's something that is absolutely critical. The shape is perfect on it. And I think without actually having the car in front of you, it will be hard to judge. Now, hopefully at some point over the coming years, we'll be able to get to the point where we can scan a whole car in and then do a virtual reality walk round of it, which will, of course, allow you to do the same thing. But we're not quite at that point yet, but watch this space. Escort, that's now on the ramp. Now Vader's off the ramp. Just giving it that a general check over. As we said previously, it's coming for door skins, a few little jobs that we were doing, like we put a bigger radiator fan on it. And because it's now done quite a lot of miles since it left here, and it's never really had a sort of decent service other than basic oil changes, we're just going over everything with a fine-tooth comb, just checking on everything's, you know, in terms of bushes and any wearing parts, checking all the fasteners, and it's generally looking good, actually. We spotted one split bush on one of the trailing arms, but other than that, everything looks good on it, so really happy with that. John's on with the Golf, which is, I have to say, looking extremely good day by day. It's some of the time with these projects where they get put to one side for a bit and picked up, you sort of lose, over time, you lose the sort of enthusiasm of how spectacular it was going to look from the start. And now I've kind of, the enthusiasm's really been rekindled, seeing the engine bay come together on it. You know, it looks really nice. I mean, people will always question the engine choice in this because it's quite a heavy engine, the VR6. But it makes perfect sense when you take into account what the guy actually wants to do with it. And he basically just wants to cruise to shows, you know, general use, but not planning on driving it in any sort of performance fashion. and they sound great. So for something just to cruise smoothly and effortlessly and sound awesome, you know, it's a really good choice. And it looks the business. That's the thing, that now we've put the engine covers back on it. We made like a little plain black anodized aluminium cover for the centre a while ago. And now it's all kind of coming together. I think it looks really great. A few things John's been on with, the coil pack. I think I mentioned last time we wanted to use the standard original coil pack, which is amplified, which won't work with the ECU we're using. So John's taken that apart, removed all the amplifier section and rewired it, so it's just bypassed the amplifier in that, but it still means we can use physically that coil pack because it bolts to the casting of the engine cover on there. And then he's been just going through everything necessary to get it fired up for the first time. And actually, I think it was yesterday, span it over for the first time on the starter, getting oil circulating around it. He's just about to connect an oil pressure gauge up to it now, so we can turn it over and see if we get oil pressure on it before we actually go for the first fire up. But everything's coming into place, and it's great to see the front end coming together as well. We've got the headlights on, grille on, bumper indicators. So sort of from feeling like we're a long way away from completing it, suddenly it all feels like it's come together really nicely on that. So I'm actually really excited to drive that for the first time. I think it's going to be nice. It feels like it's one of those cars where it's just going to be sun out, window down, arm out the window, VR6 throbbing away. I'll be sad to hand it over. And on the subject of handovers, Vader, which is now missing from here, is in our paint booth. Because Scott is doing the final clean off basically before it goes to Topaz, who are going to be doing the final detailing and PPF job on it. We had a few little jobs left to do on it. We got the headlight bezels back from anodizing. They look stunning. They've always been a subject throughout the whole process from when we decided to do our own sort of machined headlight surrounds. I was a bit nervous about how they'd turn out, and then when I saw them machined in the bare aluminium, I thought, wow, yeah, they're going to look pretty smart. And then when I saw them in the black, I was just like, yeah, that's perfect. So they're on the car now. George is just making a template for the Vader lettering that we had machined for the back panel. Because Topaz want to put the PPF on before we put the badges on, we're making basically a mounting alignment template so they can offer that up after they've PPF'd it and align all the badges and just stick them on themselves. I've been writing out the sort of user guide for the car, which covers how to operate everything, you know, fluids, servicing, all that sort of thing. So yeah, we're just in that absolute final stages. We're sort of polishing out any light scratching, etc. from the paintwork, but there's no point us going absolutely mental on it because obviously Topaz will machine polish it before they do the PPF, but we just want to get it to a state where we're happy that we can hand it over and it looks pretty smart to start with. So yeah, that should be leaving us in the next couple of days, and then I'll be going down to meet the owner when it gets handed over from Topaz, so hopefully I'll take a camera with me then and we'll see a bit of the final handover. I shall now hand over to Nat, I think, to see what's been going on in the metal workshop. So here's Nat, and I'll see you next week.
Right, well, hi folks, thanks Cal for the handover, and here we are in the fabrication shop for another week of another episode of Uncut. And in front of us is our mould stroke former, whatever you'd like to call it really. Its involvement with the Jensen is reasonably complicated, but it has now turned up from KS Composites. They've machined it based on the CAD data that we supplied them, which was based on a scan taken from the roof of another Jensen CV8 that doesn't have a thunking great hole in it. This is going to form the basis of a fiberglass extension of the existing roof on the car to enable us to have a recess to receive the glass that will be made for the roof of the car. And we've got to create that fiberglass because it's currently missing. There's a big hole there and we need to make the return. We need to create that shape on this car. This car, as longer term viewers will remember, as the buck. This body here will be a buck, which we will then have a mould taken from, and then from that mould we'll make the carbon fibre body. So the first stage is we kind of need a mould, i.e. this, to shape a section of the buck from which to take a mould, from which to then make the final part. So it's a bit of a knock-on effect, but we've got two pieces here. This section, which is a clamp, which will be underneath, and this section here, which is the actual mould section. So the next stage on the process of this will be a bit of fine tuning and fettling and just cleaning up the surface a little bit, putting some sealer on it, and then we'll be putting some mould release on this, which we're planning to use a PTFE tape release film on this to enable us to do the moulding. And then we've got to do it all upside down on the shell, which will be fun and games, but that's not just yet. We'll be getting onto that shortly, but not just yet. So that's what that is. That's an exciting step forward. And moving around the corner, we have Land Cruiser. And I'm going to stand here and gesticulate this way in through the door. Tom's been doing a lot, as last week really, lots of little fiddly nitpick jobs. One of which was the centre console turret, I suppose would be the best description, where the gear selectors, the gear transmission shifters go. There's a machined aluminium bezel. Who loves that word? Everybody loves the word bezel. It's a machined aluminium bezel going to be made to go on the top of that turret. And that, George has drawn that, designed that. It's been 3D printed. And we've used that as a check to make sure we're happy with the design of it, which everybody is. And then we've also used that to make sure that we get the locations for all the captive nuts for the bolts that hold that in place in the right places. So Tom's used that, drilled all holes using that as a drill guide, and then he's TIG welded on the back all the captive nuts for the bolts that hold that down. So that's now done. He's been doing some bits of finishing off regarding the dashboard. He's been making the mounting for the ECU and PDU that are going on this car, or PDM, or whatever you like to call it, the power distribution box of electronics from Motec that will be going on the car. It's going to be a Motec ECU and a Motec PDM, and they're both mounted on a plate, like a sub plate, which will be going under the dash, and we need threaded bosses to bolt that to. So he's been sorting out that and getting that installed. I don't know if that's done. That's not quite done yet, but that's in process. He's also been reassembling various parts of the car because, all being well, next week the owner will be visiting for a bit of a sitting-in trial. The owner and his wife will be coming so that they can have a sit in the car and check seating position, make sure that things are in the right place, and that it's. I'd use the word comfortable guardedly. I don't think it's ever going to be the most comfortable vehicle in the world if one is used to luxury vehicles, but that the seat and the pedals and the steering wheel and everything are in the right places relative to each other, and that they're happy with all control positions and generally happy with all the fundamental building blocks and metalwork before we take it all apart and do the final bits on the. We've got quite a lot finishing off to do on the underside of the body tub, so when we get to that stage we'll take that off, put that on rotisserie, spin it round, do all the finish welding, a few reinforcers to spot weld on, various bits to do underneath. We'll do all that once we take that off the chassis, and at that point we can then do a few jobs on the chassis as well that we need to do in terms of various provisions for wiring and plumbing, basically, to be attached to the chassis. That's also been happening as well. There's been some provisioning done in the back for the weld-on studs that are carrying the wiring loom at the back of the vehicle. And sorry. Yeah, I was going to come to them. It's all right, Tom, don't worry. And Tom's reminding me about the tank carriers, but we'll come to them in a minute because they're a nice bit of work in the front. Seats are back in. And another thing, we're saying the seats are back in. Under the seats, we've scanned the two fuel tank enclosures because they're not a particularly simple shape. Because of the various things, they have to clear the chassis on one side, the inner sill on the other, the exhaust systems, the cross tube that links the two sections of the chassis, various bits of gearbox and other assorted things under there. They're quite a complicated shape. I started actually just drawing them from basic measurements, but actually there's quite a few things areas where it's possible to go wrong. Now, Cal mentioned earlier in the video that we now are up and running with our 3D scanner, our Peel 3D scanner, which was supplied by Solid Print 3D, who are based in Kenilworth, fairly locally to us. We were training yesterday with Dan from Solid Print, and he went through it all with us, and it was a very good, very productive day's training. And today I've had a play with this and scanned the 2 fuel tank enclosures, cleaned them up, got them on the laptop now, and it now means I can draw the, well, we can back that problem down the, back that job down the road slightly and carry on with more important things, but it means that then I've got the data without needing the body tub to hand. I've got the data, I can draw the fuel tanks to go into those recesses at my leisure. Not that there's an enormous amount of time to move these jobs into, but it means I don't have to, it doesn't depend on me having this to hand to be able to measure the tank recesses. So yeah, now I've got that data, we can make the tanks a really nice fit in there, because we're going to have a foam lining in the recess that the tank basically sits in and is then clamped down into, so that they do need to be relatively accurate. So that's solved now, we've got the scan data for that. And moving on, I'm going to run around the front here. In the front, Tom had done a little bit on the radiator surround last week, just filling in the original holes and getting it all to sit centrally, which he's finished off. And then he's made, we drew up on CAD, and then CNC plasma cut, and then he's rolled, folded, done a bit of shaping, and then TIG welded together these tank receivers for either side of the radiator. Those are going to have a clamp section that bolts onto them, and then there'll be a round aluminium tank in each of those that's clamped in by a steel strap that goes around the outside. We just like that idea of doing it that way. It just seemed to fit in with the general ethos of the vehicle, rather than having the tanks as a permanent feature all fabricated together and bolted in. I just like the idea of having them strapped in like that. I think it just sort of suits everything. So we've got to fabricate the tanks at some point. We'll probably get Concept Racing to fabricate the tanks, just because we've got far too much to do, to be quite honest, and their aluminium TIG welding is beautiful. But we've got to make the little strap sections for those as well. Yeah, it's not a major job. We've got to make some little tabs and then make the strap sections for there. So yeah, this is getting really quite close now. As of next week, I think it'll be body off, hopefully by end of next week, body off, and then doing the work on the underside. So yeah, we're getting quite close with that now. Moving on again, we'll go on to Churchill, where Stu's been very busy. In fact, Stu's actually just started on the near side of Churchill now, but we'll walk round to the off side because he's getting somewhere near with this now. There's a bit of fine tuning still to do, but he's got the fundamental building blocks somewhere close. I can see a couple of areas where there's still things to do, but he's certainly getting it pretty close. First and foremost, the door now has a door skin on it. That's all clinched round, folded around the edges. He's, I believe his metalwork, yes he has, that's largely metalwork now along there, and metal finished. And as you can see from the spots, yesterday we did a little scan of that area during our little training day, because we're going to be 3D modelling the handle assembly that goes into the door there and making it so that it fits into the existing sheet metal work, and there'll be a bezel, the word again, if you like, in the door there, and the handle is going to incorporate into the trim strip that runs down the side of the car here. It was chrome, it will be copper on this. Trim strip that runs down the side of the car will actually form the handle at that point. So we'll have a section that is fitted exactly to the back of the sheet metal there, and using the scan data we can basically machine an aluminium piece that exactly fits the door. And again, jobs like that are extremely difficult to do without the scanner. With the scanner we can just scan the surface, add the thickness of the material to it, so we know exactly where the surface is on the back that we can't actually get to with the scanner, and then machine a piece to fit it perfectly. So yeah, that's on George's to-do list is doing the handle. So Stu's basically 90% there with the lower half of the door now. That's come along really well. As I say, he's got the bit to do on the gap at the bottom, but the sill's not fixed in place yet, so there's a little bit of scope to tweak the gap there. And we've got some more work to do on the frame. I'm still not completely set on exactly how we're doing that. I've batted that one down the road a little bit because I have a lot of other jobs to do this week. Next week we'll be making the final decisions, addressing there were a few comments I'd noticed, quite a lot of comments on that. One of them had mentioned 3D printing. Yeah, that's not going to work for this application. There's a way of making a 3D print work for this application, but the actual print wouldn't be the final part. It's possible to 3D print a mould for an investment, basically, and then use a lost wax casting, using a lost plastic or wax casting based on a 3D print to cast those frames. However, that would actually be probably in this case be more expensive and more difficult than simply machining them from plate. The other point, somebody had mentioned making them from steel. I think we can't, for a very good reason, very simple reason, that if you make these frames from steel, you need to plate them with something. Your plating process has to be compatible with the other plating processes you're going to carry out on them. And the problem is that chrome or copper plate will not throw into the inside of that section. So if you do that, you'll have bare untreated steel on the inside of these, which will rust. Now we could paint that, but it's not a very satisfactory solution to the inside of something that's going to have all sorts of grot almost permanently inside it. It will basically make the frames rot away. It's one of the key reasons they were originally made from brass. They don't corrode and they coat in chrome very nicely. Brass and basically non-ferrous alloys are really the way to go for that. We could obviously fabricate these in stainless if we were going for a silver effect over the car and using stainless steel elsewhere, but we're not using stainless steel elsewhere. We're actually using copper elsewhere, and the front bright work on the car, the existing bright work that we're reusing, is currently brass. Now we can copper plate brass, and it's a copper finish that we're going for on the car, so that's fine. We can use that existing bright work. Obviously here we can't use the existing bright work, so it's trying to find a solution, and at the moment I'm fairly convinced, having the other option was to try and find a supplier of the correct channel sections. But having spoken to a few people I know in the trade who work on older vehicles like these and older, that isn't really an available section. So the conclusion I think is going to end up that we are going to machine them from plate, but that's not quite been made yet. Going back to here, Stu's also been working on finishing the C-pillar section and getting that all welded into the window frame, which is quite fiddly because of where we didn't want to disturb the inner spot weld, so he's welded it on the step recess, which is where the rubber flip on the rear the rear screen rubber sits in this first recess. So he's actually done the joint in there, and then got it made off into the gutter and spot welded around in the gutter and metal finished all the way around here. It's actually looking extremely good now. Obviously he's got the joints to put in once he actually finishes the quarter panel. That's looking really quite good. There's a little bit of work still to do on the door. We've had a bit of a nightmare with the frame. There's still work to do there, but we'll see that once we have the final solution on getting that lot fixed. But yeah, it's coming together really nicely. I don't think I've missed anything too much on there. As I say, Stu's today, I've seen that he's working on the other side of the car, and he's been stripping the B-post out and getting the sections made for the B-post. And I believe the next step now is he's going to get the other side door to the same stage as this door, on the basis that he knows how long this door is. He's going to match the door lengths, go from there, and then do the quarter panel afterwards on that side. So that'll all work quite nicely. And moving on from there, we'll whip round to have a look at the Morris. Go around here. And as we can see, I'll go up this side and not trip over any wings. The Morris is now had the next phase, which was we'd had the epoxy on the outside of the Morris last week. The next step on this week is that the Raptor, I mean other jobs have been going on as well, but the main step forward on the body is that the Raptor is now on. And yeah, when we've used that, because the inside's being largely trimmed, all the areas that are having trim over them are now done with, we're now covered in black Raptor. It's U-Pole Raptor truck bed line, sprayable. Most of you will be aware of that we use that. It's a sprayable truck bed liner that we use on underbody and in car on everything we build basically. We don't always do it black. It can be tinted body colour, and we often do it tinted body colour, but the owner's choice on this one was to go for black. So that's a black finish. It's very hard, very chip resistant, very tough. And that's been applied over our zinc metal spray process, which means that the chances of underbody corrosion are basically zero for a large chunk of the foreseeable future. We don't really issue a warranty period other than the fact that there won't be any reasonable corrosion for any reasonable period of time, and even if it's damaged underneath, the results of that damage should be very confined in terms of the chipping shouldn't cause any corrosion to get under the coating, because the zinc metal spray will act sacrificially and prevent that travelling underneath. So yeah, that's all tough coated, built to be used, not just looked at. That's all on now. There should be hopefully some nice footage of bits of that. And yeah, that's where we're at on that. So the next phase is, I think I touched on last time, actually skipping around a little bit, I think I touched last time on why we do this in the order we do. Now we've got the Raptor on the underside and inside and primer on all of the other surfaces. It means that effectively all the bare steel is then sealed in by this point. So we can now put, once we've seam sealed it in the engine bay, we can now put water on this. We will put film in the aperture to try and stop it spreading all over the place too much. But basically we can now wet block, as a final process, wet block the epoxy primer to get the final 800 grit finish on the shell that we'll use to do the final paint over. So that's why we've done it in that order. And then the next step is all the removable panels that are sort of around me here will all be getting to that stage as well. So they're going to have the Raptor applied to the back faces of them. Then they can be demasked. The car will all be built back up again to check it, or check to a final check on all the fits, and all the epoxy will then be blocked, and then it's ready for final paint. So that's getting very, very close now. So yeah, that should be pretty nice to see. It's not too far away. And I think at that point, that probably covers everything that we've done, everything that's been going on this week. So see you again soon.